Hello again. Earlier I showed you how I'd stuck the patterns onto the wood ready for cutting out, and here they are. I've got them all here ready. There's the main part and there's the little overlay that goes on it. I've got the small bracket and the little shelf itself that this uses this small bracket. This is the shelf piece and there's a small bracket. You'll notice that I've got two pieces of wood together there, two pieces there. There are actually three there. I've two very thin overlay pieces and one standard size one, and then there's two pieces on the main background board. Before I do any cutting, the next step is to cut this out. But before I do that, I'll just have a little quick word about the blades. Now, I'm not going to say too much because the subject of fret saw blades is a video in itself actually, and I have covered it a little bit in other videos too. But basically I'm just going to talk about the blades as pertain to doing this particular design. Now, there are three types of blade mainly to worry about. There are quite a few different ones, but for the purposes of what I'm talking about here, there are only three to consider. One is the standard fret saw blade, where all the teeth point downwards. When I say downwards, that's the direction that the blade's fitted in the saw. Don't put the blade in upside down so it points upwards, because it'll clatter about and drive you mad. The second type is the reverse tooth blade, which is what I'm going to be using here, and I'll explain about that in a moment. The third type is the spiral tooth blade. Do not consider using a spiral tooth blade, especially if you're new to scroll sawing, because it will drive you mad. Now, I know there are some people, they do absolutely wonderful work with spiral blades, and I take my hat off to them. I think spiral blades are an abomination. They're absolutely impossible to control, and I wouldn't advocate using them at all unless you're absolutely desperate and you've got nothing else. A spiral tooth blade is really an ordinary blade that's been twisted so that the teeth point in all directions, and hence the blade will cut in all directions. So my advice is don't use a spiral blade. Now, I'm going to be using the number 5 reverse tooth blade, and what that means simply is that the bottom 6 teeth of the blade point the opposite direction, i.e. upwards, whereas the top teeth point downwards, the main cutting teeth. The reason for reverse tooth blades is that with normal blades you do get a cutout or splintering at the bottom of the wood, which they sometimes call the kerf, and it needs a bit more sanding and stuff. If you use a reverse tooth blade, it cuts this down to a minimum, because the bottom teeth are pointing upwards rather than downwards, so they don't tend to leave the splintering on the bottom of the wood. You have to have if you have the table too thick, obviously if you've got a table on top like I've got and it's too thick, then the bottom teeth won't touch the work anyway, so it's a waste of time. But generally speaking, using a reverse tooth will give you a much cleaner finish, and on certain woods like hardwoods it's almost unnecessary to sand it, it's so smooth. Now, here are the 3 blades in question. On the left, this one here is just a standard fret saw blade. This is a fairly thick blade, but I've used a thick blade so you might get a better chance of seeing the teeth, which you probably can't anyway. In the middle is a reverse tooth blade, and these bottom 6 teeth are pointing in that direction, upwards away from the camera, whilst the majority of the teeth, the cutting teeth, are pointing downwards. And on the far right is a spiral blade, which, as I said, I wouldn't recommend you use. So for this project I'm actually going to use the reverse tooth blade. This is the actual blade I'm using at the moment. This is a number 5 reverse tooth blade. You'll see it's considerably thinner than that one. It's not the thinnest available, but it's the blade I'm going to use for this project. Now, before I start the actual cutting, I thought it might be a good idea to give you a few pointers on the bench, so to speak, because it might not be too clear when I'm doing the actual cutting due to the noise of the machine. You might not be able to hear what I'm saying, and you might not be able to see properly because my hands will be in the way. So what I've done, I've enlarged a small part of the design here, and I thought I might give you a few pointers and tips of how to cut it out. Now, bear in mind, these are my methods. They're not necessarily the right methods. Other people have a different way of doing it, but this is how I would do it. Now, this is part of the pattern, and these pieces in here are the cutouts that you've got to remove. This is the outside, the main part of the pattern here, and this is the outside line. So we've got to remove these bits of wood in here. So the first thing you do normally is drill your holes where you're going to put the saw in. It doesn't really matter. Some people are fussy, but for example, if I was doing this bit here, I would drill the hole around here somewhere. And for example, that one, I'd probably put it in the middle. But just make sure you put it in where you think is the most appropriate. Some people drill it near the line so it's easier to get onto the line. Personally, I don't do that because sometimes you don't get it accurate and it spoils the actual line, so I would put mine in the middle like that. Anyway, having done that, the next thing is you've got to cut. Now, you've got sharp corners here, here, here and here. There are 4 sharp corners basically on there, and these are sharper than most. Now, for normal corners like that, don't try sawing up to the line and going into the corner and then turn your saw around quickly and come out again. Where it's really sharp like that, I mean, you can do it if you're an expert, but even an expert, if you haven't got a very, very thin blade, it will show around there where you want it sort of sharp. So what I would do in this case is take your saw across to the line there. You first cut from the hole in that direction to the line there, and then turn the saw sharply and cut into the corner like that. Then back your saw back out, back into the hole, and then make another cut across to this line here, like that. Turn the saw sharply, I hope you can see this, my hand's probably in the way, and cut into that corner. Now, having done that, this piece will fall out, alright? So then, you can then cut across into that corner, and you can do the same into that corner. Now, the reason for doing that is this, and I'll show you up here on a separate piece. If you've got, say this is your line you've got to cut into, there's the corners there. Now, we cut down here, and as I said, you cut down into a nice straight right angle here, and then swiftly turn into that end there, and then back up and do the same that way. The temptation, especially when you're a beginner, which seems the obvious way of doing it, is to make a nice sweeping cut like that. That seems the obvious way to do it, but it's the wrong way. In my opinion, it's the wrong way. Because what happens is, you cut into the corner there, okay, you've done a nice cut, and then you back the saw back down there, and you want to cut along there. Well, what happens is, when you cut along here, the saw blade will try to continue up there rather than going along that line, and the result is, instead of getting a nice straight line like that, what you'll get is this. You'll get a little bit where it'll go up like that, and then eventually you'll overcome it and go in the corner, and you'll get a little bump there. Now, you could, I suppose, spend time sandpapering and filing it, but it's a bit fiddly. And if you do it by my method, by going like this, here's the line, you go straight to the line like that, do an about turn and go in that corner. When you cut the other way, and you bring your saw blade along this way, it's got a really sharp corner here to bite into. The blade will actually have something to bite into rather than this cut where it will veer off. So I think it's always better to do a right angle cut. Now, once you've done that, when you look at this corner here, this is a particularly sharp corner. You can't do an about turn there and go along here. But what you could do if you wanted, I mean, you could do it the way I've just described and cut to there and then do an about turn. That's perfectly acceptable. Or what you can do is back the saw along here and then come straight out and cut round there, because that is sharp enough that you can back the saw in and come out and do a straight cut. You can't do it on that corner. You'd have to treat that corner the same as that. So that's my method of doing that. Always cut straight to the line like that and do a turn and go into the corner. If you've got a corner which is more rounded, then you can go straight round. It depends. But for example, down here, you can't do this. You've got to go down to the corner like that. You can't really go straight round there, turn the saw, because you're going almost 360 degrees. So what you can do, you can back the saw down there and then cut out like that, or you can approach it from this end. Now, while we're on the subject of these leaves, that's another thing. When you're cutting these out, don't try starting here, say, and going up here and round like that in one operation. It's always better, really, to cut from here, say, start there, cut round into that corner there, and then cut round into that corner there. The reason is that depending on the way the grain goes in the wood, it can be a delicate part. This isn't so bad actually, because this is quite a broad leaf, but some of the leaves might have you might have a point like this, for example, on your fretwork. Well, this is going to be a weak point, and if you're cutting around in this direction, when you get to that end, that can quite easily snap off, especially if you're using very thin wood or whatever. Whereas the same if you do it that way. But if you cut from this end, then this is held before you, if you see what I mean, when you start to cut that sharp piece there, which is delicate, it's held in place by this. But when you're going the other way, it's more likely to snap off. So always approach them from the end there. I mean, these are quite rounded. For example, that one there is only a short stub, so you could simply go like this and round and do that in one operation. Unless, of course, it had a point there and you wanted to make you know, if the leaf was like this, for example, then it's always better to start from this end and go in there and go in there and do it. But if it's rounded, you can do it in one operation, but not if it's too long a leaf. If it's a great long thing, that's the point that it might come off. Again, it depends on the grain. If the grain's going that way, if you're lucky and the grain of the wood's going that way, that will be a lot stronger than, for example, if the grain's going across like this. Because if the grain's that way, and you don't always have a choice, because some might be going one way and some the other, that is the weak part, will snap off, so always do that. And the other thing to mention, while we're on the subject, there's probably lots of things to mention, I've probably forgotten about a lot of them. Look at the pattern as a whole. What I mean is, this here is a long sweeping curve. It's like an egg shape, an oval if you like, and this line goes straight into that line, if you see what I mean. Now when you're cutting fretwork out, sometimes it's easy to forget this because you can't see the pattern. It's just a pencil drawing, for example, and you don't think of it as an oval. You're thinking of cutting apart. For example, you cut this piece out first and you got that piece out, and then you change the saw blade and you cut this piece out. It's easy to forget that you need to maintain this nice sweeping curve, and it's quite easy not to have these two line up. You might go off a bit there, and the same here, like so. Well, when you finish the design, you'll notice that there doesn't line up. It's not obvious when you're cutting it, but later on it will be. So always look ahead, think of the pattern as a whole, as a nice sweeping curve like that, and note that. I mean, it's not always possible, sometimes you'll go offline, but do try and bear that in mind. If you do make a mistake when you're cutting a leaf, don't try and, say for example you're cutting along here and you suddenly go offline like this. You know, try and just alter the leaf a bit, because it's very difficult to go back and cut that bit off, because the saw will tend to keep going that way and you'll end up with a ruffled edge. So change the design slightly if you must. You know, don't bother messing around with that. Go make the leaf a bit thinner, go like this for example, and move the leaf over a little bit. Because you won't notice it, it doesn't make any difference. And likewise, if you go in up here and you go offline, don't fiddle around with it. Just try and alter the whole leaf shape. Just go like this or something, so whichever's the most convenient, so that it won't be noticed, but you'll have a nice straight line. Because the worst thing is when you sort of hacked at it, sometimes if you go offline, the blade won't want to follow the new line. It'll just you'll hack about at it and get a rough finish. So anyway, I've talked enough about this. So the next thing is we'll get the saw going and we'll have a go at cutting the pattern out. But I thought it would be a good idea to show you a few hints and tips first. Anyway, we'll get on with the sawing. I've jabbered enough.